Adi Da Samraj was born, awakened, for the purpose of liberating all beings. That is the function of the divine avatar. And he was born, as he described, as the bright, as the living force of reality itself, as conscious light. In his lifetime, he accomplished his purpose, which was to establish that force of his own conscious light permanently on the earth and altogether, such that beings would be able to realize and awaken to that force of reality.
I am your real state, real condition, speaking to you, being present with you through a form like your own. That is the mystery of the spiritual master. I'm not merely suggesting all of this is so, thinking it's logically so, communicating it to you as a metaphor. I am this. This is my realization. This is my state. I am telling this to you because it is also your state. I am here in this form to make this communication to you and this transmission to you so that you will realize that state.
From the beginning of my here-born life, I have known a perfect alternative to the oppressive internal dilemma of my natural existence. I have played in the problem of my alternatives. But from my earliest experience of life, I have enjoyed a condition that as an infant child I named and called the bright.
One of the ways of understanding the uniqueness of Adi Da is appreciating his state as a baby. Usually we think of ourselves as the body, or maybe the mind, or some kind of subtle essence within. But that was not his awareness at birth. He was aware of himself as the reality of consciousness and light, what he later called conscious light. And when he became able to use words at a very young age, he gave that condition the name the bright. And that's the name he used throughout his life to describe it. And he saw not only that he himself was the bright, but that everyone and everything else exists in that same bright reality.
Even as a baby, I remember only crawling around inquisitively with a boundless feeling of love, of joy, light and freedom in the middle of my head. I was the same as everyone and everything, except it became clear that others were apparently unaware of the thing itself.
If we look at Adi Da's early life, it may appear to be conventional, but it was actually anything but that. He was actually trying to crack the code, you could say. If the bright is true, he thought, then why are people suffering? So he intentionally threw himself into the full range of human life.
This entirely intentional endeavor required of me a willingness to experience the effects of that limited life I had accepted to live. I became profoundly aware of conflict and suffering everywhere. I discovered the same natural necessity all human beings feel for illusions, for exotic pleasures, for relief and distraction.
As he was growing up, he immersed himself in all kinds of human experience. When he got to college, he studied the great works of philosophy, literature, and art. And later on, he was instructed by a series of great spiritual masters.
He examined everything in absolutely minute detail, and in so doing he did crack the code. He discovered the underlying myth that prevents human beings from realizing the truth of their condition, their awareness of the bright. Finally, by the time he was 30, this process had reached its fulfillment.
Then suddenly, I understood most perfectly. I realized that I had realized. There was a most perfect end to every kind of seeking, dilemma, suffering, separation, and doubt. The thing about the bright became obvious.
Between 1962 and 1964, prior to his reawakening, Adi Da was engaged in a process of continuous writing. He wrote down everything that was occurring in his life and spent a great deal of time doing this, filling up notebook after notebook. And his intent in all of this writing, and it was a spiritual practice for him, was to uncover or reveal what was the underlying myth or logic or rationale that was behind unconsciously every human being's activity. And it was finally discovered by him through this process of writing, and it was described very accurately in the ancient Greek myth of Narcissus.
The really interesting thing about the myth of Narcissus is that Narcissus is gazing at his own reflection in the pond, but thinks it is somebody else. He is not aware that he is falling in love with himself, and his loved one, who is there, he doesn't even notice. So eventually he dies completely alone, staring at his own reflection. And Adi Da said, this is a perfect symbol of how human beings operate. We presume ourselves to be separate, we are focused entirely on ourselves, and we feel vulnerable, and therefore we protect ourselves more and more and increase our own separateness.
As soon as you get up in the morning, you are you. And you remain you until the end of the day when you go to sleep. It's a non-stop. You spend the entire day in the waking state, effectively kneeling by the pond, looking at yourself. And it doesn't make any difference who or what you are apparently perceiving. You are always looking at yourself. You are always turned upon your separate self, you see.
You're always wrapped up in the self-contraction of the faculties.
But Adi Da then goes on to say, the presumption of separation is an illusion. It is not reality. It is a myth, just like the myth of Narcissus.
You're always in the position of consciousness, but you speak and think and have problems because you presume you're in the position of the body and in a concrete world that is different from consciousness. But it is not true, and you have never had such experience. You claim to be having such an experience. You are speaking for an illusion. It's just as much of an illusion as the image in the pond that is viewed by Narcissus, and to the point where he falls in love with it. He doesn't fall in love with it because he thinks it's himself. He falls in love with it because he thinks it's somebody else. He doesn't know it's himself. You don't know the world is your own consciousness. You presume, using the metaphor of the separate body, that the world exists independent of consciousness, whereas neither you nor any human being who has ever lived, nor any being who has ever lived, has ever experienced the world as anything but a mode of consciousness.
I met Adi Da in 1972. It was actually before the ashram opened, and a friend invited me to a place to meet some people.
I was nervous about it because I could not imagine offering flowers at a man's feet.
The first time I had seen him, my body and feelings responded spontaneously.
He scanned the entire room, just quickly looking into the eyes or the face of each devotee.
There was a sense of joy, of real happiness that came over me. I just felt really happy to see him.
And then he just turned his head and zeroed in on me. And I wasn't prepared for it. It was like he grabbed my heart. And he reached a depth in me that I had no idea even existed.
That was the immediate response. In later years, he explained that the heart responds to his state.
And the result of it, one of the results of it, was that I felt completely, I wanted to give the flowers.
When Adi Da first began teaching in 1972 in Los Angeles, he taught in a very formal manner. He sat in front of his devotees, he instructed them through discourse and so forth, he gave them disciplines. He saw after almost 2 years of doing this that his devotees weren't growing mightily, and they were tending to get stuck in very ordinary pursuits.
It became clear in the earliest year or two that I was going to have to allow for the fact that I was not being approached in anything like the traditional manner. The people were not approaching me with significant qualifications or even profound inclination toward realization.
And so he made a very radical decision.
I abandoned the sort of natural distance between myself and them, of the guy there sitting formally and talking in the back room or in the hall, and just started to live with them and started to be amused. We just lived together as people, as those people were already living in the world. And I carried on a consideration with them, face to face with all of their tendencies, amusements, absurdities. All the absurdity, ridiculousness, obsessiveness, and excessiveness of ordinary life.
Adi Da called this period of time his submission work, in which what his devotees were doing, what they were involved with, he did that as well, with them. And by doing that, and sometimes even more exaggeratedly than they were doing it because he had no limitations, by doing that, he started to reflect to devotees what they were doing.
And we went on together, sometimes partying, sometimes sitting seriously in the hall, sitting in meditation, being hilarious, being ridiculous, all the rest of it.
It was constantly changing. We went through periods of time of the most intense religious practice, strict diet, sometimes raw diet, exercises, yoga, working very hard, spiritual practices, meditation, chanting. There were periods of very intensive discipline, followed by periods of no discipline at all, except to be in his company.
You said that we have to become human before we actually be concerned about spiritual work, or at least realize our humanity. I can sense I might be able to become human, but I don't connect myself up with anything beyond that, being able to, having faith, being able to go beyond that.
That's why I say you have to become human first.
Those were times when I laughed harder than I've ever laughed in my entire life. I would be more ecstatic than I've ever been in any situation before. And what would happen is he would reveal his freedom and his ecstasy and his joy and his humor and his happiness. And everybody that was there would be drawn into it.
In 1974, Adi Da created what he called one of his great teaching demonstrations, and it was relative to spiritual experience. And Adi Da saw very well that his devotees were interested in that. And so instead of just trying to say to his devotees, experiences aren't the point, he wholesale gave his devotees unbelievable spiritual experiences.
He transmitted directly through his transmission, Shaktipat, immense spiritual force, and generated just constant spiritual experiences.
But always in the midst of it, periodically, he would say, this is not the point. Spiritual experiences are not the point.
These experiences were part of this assumption of being a separate self and the seeking for experience, whether high or low. So it is only when there is this relaxation from that search that the undifferentiated field of light, his own state, his brightness, is realized. You become available to it because all the rest of the experiences start to fall away. It's a deepness, a quieting, and a recognition that any seeking within these realms, high or low, is not reality, is not truth. And so through this spiritual process, Adi Da Samraj draws you to what is prior.
What if everything continued to arise in every apparent sense? As is your experience even now. And yet there were no I. No separate self. Just the arising, but no separate self. None. Not a trace of it. not a single reflexive thought. Not a single self-referential thought. Ever.
And so he began this extraordinary process of encountering men and women in this time and place, the late 20th century, and all that they were doing and all that they were involved with, and teaching relative to what was actually in front of him.
He was establishing a new tradition. He was establishing a new way of life. And so, especially during the late 70s, he began to really fill out what this new tradition, this new way of life would involve.
How do you live a spiritual life? How do you function? And Adi Da was never abstract. He used to say that spiritual life begins from the ground up, and that spiritual life is not an otherworldly matter. So you're living in the world. How do you live it?
He wrote very extensive books about right diet, right exercise, right sexual relationships.
And summary books relative to the entire way, his entire spiritual process altogether.
My purpose in associating with people is not to entertain them, not to be believed in, not to be worshipped in this nonsensical downtown fashion, so that you are never changed but only consoled. My purpose in dealing with people, my purpose in my teaching, is to make it possible for you to be intimate with me in spiritual terms, so that you yourself may live this practice and fulfill it. Then you also can transcend yourself and become radiant and live as love.
Adi Da Samraj had been looking for a place to create and establish a hermitage that was set apart fully so that it could be only about spiritual practice.
And he was hoping to create an order of spiritually advanced renunciates as one of the vehicles of his teaching. As we approached the island, it was amazing to see Adi Da looking down at the island and taking in this vast emerald green, beautiful island surrounded by a reef, and to know that this entire place had been gifted to him for his spiritual work.
He came here on 1983, came on the seaplane, and he landed on the beach on Natam. I didn't know anything about him. As we go along, then I realized he's one of the men who tells the true thing, life. He blessed everybody on the island, not only his family, everybody, every living thing on the island, he blessed them.
From the moment we arrived in Fiji, I felt the Master's work change. He was intent on making this island an empowered sanctuary that could be used for pilgrimage for all time. And he felt an intensity to work. It was like a feverish intensity, and it was difficult for all of us.
He was looking for the signs in his devotees of this profound response to him, of this true renunciation, and devotees he could take seriously.
At that point, he had done everything he could to be exactly like his devotees and teach them in that context, to the point of utter frustration in that nowhere further to go with it.
In 1986, on January 11th, Adi Da relinquished his teaching work in the form that he had embraced and lived it to that point. It was a moment of profound yogic ordeal for him, and he almost dropped the body completely.
Adi Da came to the Mountain of Attention Sanctuary a few months after this January 11th event. He looked entirely different than I'd ever seen him look before. He'd been fasting for several months. There was an incredible intensity to his body and to his whole force of his being. His eyes were fiery and searing with intensity. And he looked, as he described it, as an ascetic on fire. And that's what he felt like. The energy was just pouring out of his body. It felt like an electrical current.
You could feel his profound commitment to humankind and his profound commitment to liberate everyone from mortality itself, from all the sorrow associated with this realm of birthing and dying, and all the conflicts, and the profound passion that he was manifesting was extremely moving. He was weeping, tears streaming down his face, and reaching out and calling to all the billions on earth with such overwhelming love. And this love brought him back into the physical body. So in that moment, the nature of his work changed dramatically. As he said, he descended to his toes. His spiritual force descended to his toes such that he assumed the mortal condition.
And he was conveying this, really showing me, demonstrating to me a new phase in his work, which wasn't about being my friend or drawing me into that kind of company in the same way, but showing me a profundity that he now expected me to relate to.
When I began to teach, I taught only the radical or most direct process of self-transcendence, or transcendence of the self-contraction, and immediate realization of the transcendental divine self-condition.
Adi Da asked his devotees to embrace disciplines and practices, including many periods of meditation each day, raw diet, disciplines that would be regarded as more austere and ascetic, to focus entirely on the profundity of the process he was offering.
There is not, now or ever, any personal identity, but always only the ultimate identity, or consciousness itself, already free, one, whole, full, and all bliss.
Adi Da was revealing the ultimate stages of this way to devotees and working to draw people into that, and showing people really that, you're not the body, you're not the mind, you're literally consciousness itself, conscious light, as he says, the bright, that is his state, but it's also the true state of all beings.
It was at that moment that he strongly began his call to renunciation, to renounce this self-contraction, this commitment to self-preservation, and to release the being into the spiritual process itself. This was his call to renunciation and realization by grace.
I spent my first 10, 11 years or so living directly around Adi Da and his family. I grew up almost as part of his family, lived with his daughters, and went to school with them. So I had the opportunity to just be around him simply as a child and experience how he was with children.
As a father, he was the most loving person that I could possibly imagine. Ever since I was little, it was just this feeling of complete unconditional love that he gave.
It was like the highlight of our day and of his day to come to his house in the evenings and eat dinner with him and watch a Disney movie or a documentary or sports.
At the same time, there was both sides. He was just completely loving and open and vulnerable, and then there was always a demand.
Our schedule was filled with all sorts of meditation and study, and he expected a lot of little children. He demanded it, but in a way that he already knew that you could do that, and it was simple. Not, you must do this. It was more like, this is what you can do, and this is what will bring happiness to your life.
You could just say anything to him and tell him anything. It was a completely open relationship. It wasn't like there was anything up to hate or judged, ever.
After the event of January 1986, Adi Da told his devotees that he could not continue doing his submission work indefinitely, that it was something that he had to be able to relinquish.
Adi Da redid all of his literature, worked on it again, and in the midst of that, called upon a greater maturity in his devotees, called upon them to grow up more.
You all have used my company for all kinds of reasons of your own over the years. And I've obliged myself to address you relative to all aspects of your limitations in order to prepare you for real practice. So I am now truly looking for your signs of preparedness. I'm looking for you to be able to make right use of my company. It's fine for you to specifically intend for there to be occasions where I might respond to questions and so forth. But I think you should understand the more fundamental purpose of coming into my company and use that occasion for that purpose specifically, which is to allow my presence to release you, to purify you, release you of your karmic limitations, to quiet the mind, and to move you beyond these limits.
Adi Da has used a very simple expression or spiritual law to describe the process of realization or the process of spiritual growth. And it's simply described as you become what you meditate on. It's a simple truth. Whatever we put our attention on is what determines our destiny or our spiritual growth. So if you're always thinking about shopping, you become shopping mind. If you're always thinking about money, you become money mind. But for those who are interested in spiritual growth and truth, it's best to meditate on a spiritual reality. If the spiritual master, the spiritual teacher, is one who has incarnated and lives as that spiritual reality, by contemplating him, by staying in a relationship with him, by putting your attention on him, then that becomes your destiny. That becomes your realization.
There is this awareness, unchanging, not characterized by any form or name, not performing any action. It is utterly, inherently free. It is pure radiance.
Conscious light is what is. The bright is what is. It is self-evidently the case. It is all that is. It is the truth, it is reality, it is God.
One of the things that he did during that time is he established a retreat process on Naitamba. And he called devotees to come to him from all over the world and spend time with him on retreat, 2, 3, 4 weeks or longer at a time. Adi Da would sit with devotees silently and just allow them to receive his blessing. Just pour his blessing on devotees and they would receive his blessing. He would also allow us to ask questions of him.
Adi Da Samraj would gather with us night after night after night after night, to the point that you didn't think you could find the physical energy even to participate with him in his enormous energy and commitment to instructing us and drawing us beyond ourselves.
These were the most remarkable, magical, beautiful, intense evenings.
He would give the most extraordinary, sublime, spiritual instruction for hours.
Dealing with the ego in each of us, that activity in each of us that separates us from the divine, from love, from truth.
The force of his sublime person, his freedom, his bliss, his love, just drew me so beyond myself that when the gathering was over and everyone had left and Adi Da was preparing to be driven to his residence on the other side of the island, I waited for him at the end of the driveway. I couldn't help myself. I held up my hands to him as the Land Rover came along, and he stopped and extended his arm to me. I came over, I kissed his hand, just in a swoon of adoration, completely given by him. Nothing I could possibly conjure up on my own.
It is only bliss. And yet, coincident with this body is this terrible knowledge, this terrible process of vulnerable sympathy and awareness of all and of all suffering, and having the circumstance of perpetual regard of the suffering of all, and being involved in that and being moved by that and constantly touching it, constantly serving to relieve beings, to limit the suffering, to transform it, to awaken beings, to heal them. What else can I say about it? The real occasion of confronting the ego and seeing the heart entirely outshine the body and the mind in perfect happiness is the only thing that really interests me. I constantly do it all by love's compassion, and at least for now, a willingness to suffer everyone as they seem and insist to be. But I am trying to make my happening work. To wake them up, I hope.
In the year 2000, in the San Juan Islands, at Lopez Island in Washington, Adi Da again went through a profound yogic transformation, a yogic death.
I walked into the room, and what I saw instantly broke my heart and brought me to tears. His body was clearly very weak, and he was having trouble breathing. His head would just go back, and his eyes would close, and he would completely leave the body, and it was terrifying. Each time this happened, we really didn't know whether he was going to return to consciousness. At a certain point, his body became more calm, and with his eyes closed, he said, "I'm here. Can you see me up here?" And we could feel him. The whole room felt like it was melting in light.
The next day, he described to me that in that process of ascent, he had gone up and to a point, a window into the bright, the undifferentiated light. And he could have gone through it, but instead he had consciously pulled himself down to stay a while longer, to point everyone to that window. So maintaining association with his physical body, but still standing as that window and as the bright beyond, so that everyone could be drawn through that window to fullest realization of him.
After the period of time at Lopez and the changes that occurred for Adi Da during that time, he said that his connection to his physical body was like one of a dandelion puff, just very tenuous and fragile.
It was really very paradoxical. It was obvious to us that his state was somehow becoming more and more rarefied, more sensitive, even more fragile, and yet his work output seemed to be getting more and more every month.
Adi Da had tremendous urgency to complete his communication. So he knew that he had a limited amount of time left in which to create more books, more recorded discourses, and to create his art. And he poured himself with immense passion into all three of these areas.
He often spoke about how the camera is like a person, in that you have a dark chamber with an opening and the light coming in, just like in your head. And you have this kind of fixed point of view that you're seeing these images played upon. And he was always working to convert that into something more profound. And so one example of that was when he was photographing at one point in the Redwoods in 2000. He had what he considered a breakthrough day relative to his photographic work, where he started leaving the shutter of the camera open and just kind of blasting the film with light. And so the whole point of what he was doing was letting in more light than was supposed to be allowed, which is a perfect metaphor really for his spiritual work and his work with students and everyone.
Adi Da often spoke about aesthetic ecstasy, how a participant, a viewer, can go beyond themselves in viewing a work of art. And in creating his images, he was calling people to become ecstatic. I remember he said that, you know, people go to a musical concert, they allow themselves to become happy and move freely with the music and, you know, just lose all self-consciousness. And so that's what he was trying to do with his artistic work, to draw the viewer beyond themselves into ecstatic participation in the arts and the aesthetic beauty and what was before them.
His divine presence grants the blessing to all beings and all things. There's no discrimination, there's no difference, there's no separation. His blessing is for everyone.
I find people's sorrows and losses to be heartbreaking and terrible and an immense burden. And I am inevitably sympathetic and bless people in their trouble. However, you must understand that that is the nature of this place. This is not utopia. It is not paradise. It is a place of death, of endings, of suffering. Brief amusements. It is not enough. One day it will be your death. All will pass. Everything will pass. Everything will be lost. Everything will change. Every conceivable separation will occur. You must know the place you're in and live in accordance with that knowledge.
At this time, Avatar Adi Da began working very intensively through the rest of his bodily lifetime to establish a special transmission circumstance where he could do his transcendental spiritual work with his rightly prepared devotees who were moving on in the process with him such that he could really transmit himself as the divine avatar, as being itself, as reality itself, as truth itself, to transparent vehicles who he could just shine through.
One of the ways that Adi Da describes it, and this is something that I felt when I first started sitting there with him, as he talks about the tuning fork, and he talks about how if one tuning fork is vibrating at a certain frequency and you put another tuning fork near it, it will sympathetically vibrate with that tuning fork. And he describes how he is like the first tuning fork and that his devotee is the other tuning fork, vibrating in resonance with him.
This is the uniqueness of his revelation, of his gift to the world, to humankind, that he reveals and transmits a state of being, not a description of a physical form. It is a state of native state of being that is native to everybody.
I feel it as a depth of being that's completely still. It's a peace that is completely free of everything. It's like a veil drops, and you suddenly see that you actually see that the divine is the case. And yes, you see that Avatar Adi Da is that, but you also see that is the truth of everything, and that he's not separate, and that nothing is separate.
In mid-2007, Adi Da's work of submission came to a definitive end. And that was actually a supremely auspicious moment because it meant that he was only relating to people on a spiritual basis. He was no longer submitting to relate to them in any kind of social manner whatsoever, but purely on a spiritual basis by allowing people to cite him, by transmitting his spiritual blessing to them, and foregoing more superficial forms of relationship that weren't really necessary anymore.
It was extraordinarily blissful. And what was even more extraordinary was that kind of quality felt like it was really pervading the entire island. I was living on the other side of the island, and it was quite a far drive to get back and forth between where I was staying and where Adi Da was. And I just remember no matter where I went on that island and no matter what I was doing, every moment had the quality of sitting with Adi Da.
There's only conscious light. This can be tacitly, summarily noticed. It's a transformation of the view or comprehension of everything.
After his physical form not being
available, this condition didn't disappear. This continues, and he just revealed that this is always been like this before he manifested in this world, and it is the case now in every moment.
Adi Da transmitted spiritual presence is his most gracious means by which he will forever grant realization to all human beings, the realization of reality itself.
That transmission of his state, which is love, just overwhelming. And, you know, I feel like ecstatically dancing for him, and it's a very, very happy life.
His force, his radiance, his light that comes into the body, literally into the body, and opens up the body, heals the body, relieves the body, allows the body to be in its natural open state, just be.
So I never saw him while he was physically alive. And when I look at him, his physical body in a photograph, that is the physical sign of the divine person. And it is an incredible, incredible grace that all beings can just see him in that way. Just to see his human form, you know that you are looking at the divine being. You know, that is just unbelievable.
To get to know this divine condition is beyond expectation. It is beyond anything that I could have ever imagined was possible, and yet it is something I've always hoped for. But to come into contact with that fullness and that revelation, that reality, is more than I could have ever imagined.
I have always been seated in the bright. That inherently, spiritually, self-bright, conscious light is even every being's very nature and ultimate, inherent, and inherently perfect self-condition, now, and now, and now.
His intention was to awaken all beings, to bring a process of awakening and a realization to everyone. All of this was done to establish in perpetuity a means for everyone to have direct access to his presence.
I am the one from whom there is no separation. I appear to be a human person, temporarily. But I am more like a mist or a quiet muttering under and through the every breath. For them, there will be no body of me alive, but I will forever be present and all expressed, the same one, forever present.
This is my perfect invitation.